From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Congress takes up a bill to subsidize semiconductors, but where is the free market Republican opposition? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Alicia Finley. Welcome to you both. Now that Senator Joe Manchin has said no to a climate tax and spending bill, Congress is moving on to other priorities. And up next this week in the Senate is funding for the CHIPS Act. And CHIPS is an acronym for Creating Helpful Incentives for the Production of Semiconductors. No one in Congress works harder than the acronym designers. Want to give them their due here. America thanks you for your service. And here is a piece of what Majority Leader Chuck Schumer told his Senate colleagues on Monday.
Right now, some of the most important manufacturers in our country are weighing whether to make their investments where to make their investments in semiconductor production. Many of them are holding off on final decisions to see what Congress does, but they're not going to wait around forever. As one company told the Wall Street Journal, without these incentives from Congress, the capital investment required for expanding production is not economically viable in the United States, given other global alternatives. Other countries have copied our legislation, and they're offering companies huge amounts of money to locate there. And that, of course, will endanger our security, economic and national. The message is not subtle. If countries do not think it's profitable to make chips here in America, they're going to go somewhere else.
So, Alicia, what is in this bill? And you heard the majority leader there. What do you make of his argument?
So the bill has been, quote unquote, slimmed down from the initial versions the Senate passed last year, which was about $200 billion, and the House passed its own version of the bill, $300 billion, in earlier this winter. Those included some other extraneous components. They were basically, quote unquote, anti-China bills. There was even provisions in there that would have required a WHO investigation of the coronavirus origins. There was, in the House bill, there was a lot of trade adjustment assistance for unions. The senators or the House representatives tried to stuff in as much as they could, but the problem is when they headed to the conference committee this summer to try to negotiate some of this, they kind of came to loggerheads and they couldn't decide on what to include, what not to include. So Schumer has now come out and he basically on Sunday, he dropped this bill that was slimmed down. It supposedly merely includes these subsidies for chip manufacturers. These subsidies have actually already been authorized by legislation that Congress passed in a defense authorization bill, but the money Congress hasn't gotten around to actually appropriating the funds. So this bill would provide about $52 billion for the chip industry. Most of that is grants, and another $24 billion or so for tax credits. Now that would be actually almost double the research and development tax credit for all companies through 2025. I mean, this is just a huge pork barrel bill for a single industry. And if it passes, other industries, you can imagine the electric vehicle or battery manufacturers asking for handouts too. Again, I think the arguments that are being made, many of them was, well, we have chip shortage. Well, actually, that chip shortage is easing partly because of the economic headwinds, concerns about a potential recession, and we're no longer seeing the demand for PCs, data processing, video games that we saw before. So actually now more chip making is becoming available for automakers. Even automakers are saying that, well, we're actually pretty good on supply for now. The other argument that we hear is that we need to do this to compete with China. Our manufacturing, our U.S. chip making manufacturing has, as a share of the global, has declined to about 12% from 37% in 1990. And much of the manufacturing has actually moved to not just China, actually, Taiwan and South Korea in particular. What's happened in the chip industry is that the chips have become essentially commoditized. So you have three big manufacturers, Samsung, Intel, and TSMC, which is based in Taiwan, that do the manufacturing. And then you have a bunch of other companies that are mostly based in the U.S. that do the design work, designing these advanced chips and designing the equipment for them. The U.S. is still the leader in the chip design, 52% of the global share, and chip making equipment, 50%. So we do actually the research and development for these chips And the more the manufacturing of the chips, such as manufacturing of other products and commodities, has been kind of moved to Asia, where it's a little cheaper, partly for labor costs, but also partly because of energy costs. I think one of the things that isn't actually considered is that one reason why the U.S. could actually become less competitive in terms of chip manufacturing is its increasing electricity costs and energy costs due to green energy. But that's a separate discussion. But the problem is we don't really need to do this to compete with China. China is already struggling on its own. We've already kind of cut off support for China's chip-making equipment. And so maybe the strongest argument, I think, is that Taiwan still produces a lot of chips. And if China were to invade Taiwan, that could potentially cut off our supply of chips. I think we have enough chip-making capacity around the world. And the U.S., actually, the Defense Department already subsidizes chip making for its own that it needs. I think Chuck Schumer actually announced earlier this year that $293 million in federal funding for a lab in upstate New York to produce chips for defense purposes. So this is just a huge handout for the semiconductor industry that has really been very successful in lobbying Congress and using its customers, the tech giants, as well, to convince the Congress members that we need to do this so we don't fall behind China, or we need to do this to help U.S. manufacturers compete when there's no evidence that this will actually do so. It'll just probably make the companies less efficient and will just create more cronyism in Washington.
And that's especially true, I think, when some of these moves, I think, look like they're happening organically anyway. And there was a pandemic chip shortage, but remember that some of that had to do with the fact that car manufacturers, for example, when the pandemic hit, they cut back on their chip orders. And then the economy came back, and the checks that went out from the government to individuals, people kept buying cars, and then those car manufacturers needed the chips, and they went and they got in the back of the line of orders. But it seems like sellers after that surely have been thinking through their supply chain resiliency, and buyers too. I don't think that an auto manufacturer would approach those decisions on chip purchases the same way this time. And the same is true on manufacturers. TSMC is building a plant in the United States. Samsung is building a plant in the United States. And so, Kim, I keep seeing, including from Chuck Schumer, this argument that there's this pandemic cause chip shortage, but I don't know why we don't let businesses respond to that in the way that they normally do to make sure that they have resilience in their supply chains.
Well, exactly. And as you point out, they're already doing so. You're talking about those investments there. We also have companies that are building new factories in the United States. Samsung's building a $17 billion factory in Texas. TSMC is building a new plant in Arizona. They want to make sure that they don't face those kind of future supply disruptions again. This was a lesson for everybody during the pandemic. And so businesses are very smart. Believe it or not, they're actually smarter than government officials. And so they're already getting ahead of this. And we are seeing global semiconductor capacity increase. It increased in 2020. It increased in 2021. It's going to grow, I think, another 8.7% this year. So now, instead of risk of shortage, we're actually confronting the very real risk of overcapacity and a glut in supply. And this is why this bill makes no sense, because first of all, again, companies are smarter than government, but also this is a straight up industrial policy, all right? Or call it corporate welfare, whatever you want to call it. This is the United States government, instead of getting out of the way in a free market and letting different businesses innovate, different businesses come to the top or fall to the bottom on the basis of how much ingenuity they have or the resources that are around them. Instead saying, we, the United States government, have determined that we are going to be a global leader in this particular industry, and we will force that to happen by means of spending extraordinary sums of money. And can I just point out, too, $76 billion for just one industry. We're getting to the point in Washington where people are throwing around billions as though they're peanuts, and they're not. Alicia talked about what could otherwise be done with this money. So this is misguided, not just in terms of a supply and demand situation. It's very misguided in terms of overall government thinking and the idea that we are adopting this kind of industrial approach.
And Alicia mentioned that this was originally passed in two bills, one in the Senate and one in the House. They're different China bills, competition bills, that the Senate and the House are having trouble reconciling. And so now Congress seems to be taking this CHIPS piece out of it and doing it separately, which is something you sometimes see on Capitol Hill. But I would point out that the Senate passage date for its competition bill originally was in June of 2021. And so that's how long this thing has been kicking around in Congress, Alicia. And to your point, I mean, if part of this was motivated, if part of the motivation for doing this originally was this pandemic chip shortage, maybe there was a stronger argument for that in June of 2021, but now here we are a whole year later, and now we're talking about doing the same thing, it seems to me, without really reckoning with the fact that the situation on the ground has changed.
I'm a little skeptical that was the original reason. I think that was a nice pretext for Congress members to try to justify was, well, we're trying to help our manufacturers. You have to note that it usually takes a few years, 3 or 4 years to even build a new chip factory. So by the time they actually are going to come online, even if you provide the subsidies right now, it would probably be 2025 at the earliest. These are very capital intensive industries. And many of them have actually, created these capital plans, investment plans well in advance. They look out for a decade. It's actually not unsimilar to, fossil fuel companies. They don't just do it year by year. Many of these companies have already actually baked in their plans, and these subsidies aren't going to substantially affect those. I mean, you're hearing from Intel that, we may delay our proposed plant factory in Ohio if the subsidies aren't passed. And I think that's actually a little bit of a smokescreen. I think it's seeing that chip demand for chips is falling. As the economy slows down, as demand slows down, you're seeing chip makers that their stock prices are plunging because this is typically a cyclical industry. And part of that is just valuations again. And with the tech industry, I think they got a little frothy. Now with interest rates rising, the valuations are falling. But I think also some of it is just investors are seeing, well, the prices of chips are going to fall as, more of this capacity gets built out. And we could even potentially see a chip glut, an overcapacity, especially if you subsidize these and encourage more production than we actually need. And we've seen this in China and so many other different realms of steel making, the real estate. This is what industrial policy does. It leads to inefficiencies and waste, which could actually end up harming the chip industry and their investors down the line.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Before the break, Alicia mentioned that industrial policy leads to waste, and part of that is that government is pretty bad at predicting which technologies and which companies are going to be the next big thing and are going to be successful. And there's a point in our editorial today on this chip business that really struck me. And it says, for the same amount of money, Congress could double the research and development tax credit for all companies through 2025. It could also throw in 100% expensing for companies and allow immediate R&D deductions through 2025. And Kim, the advantage of a policy like that is it's industry neutral, it's technology neutral, and I understand the importance that people are putting on the chip industry and why they think that that is vital. But the next big thing could be biotech. It could be AI. We could get 5 or 10 years down the road and realize that we put all this money into chips and really China is eating our lunch in some other technology, which is really where it matters.
It's a question of opportunity cost. That's absolutely right. And in addition to spreading that money equally without picking any winners and losers, think about the additional benefit if they were to do that right now as we're dealing with inflation. And you had all these companies that suddenly had an added interest in maybe expanding supply, buying that new piece of equipment. This is what we need at the moment, right? Because demand continues to outstrip supply in too many industries. I can give you too, in our very good editorial on this, reference this today, the converse. We know how this works out. If you go back, the government in its wisdom in 1987 began working with 14 different outside companies to come up with the Semitech Consortium, and they began spending about $500 million in government funds to try to increase and boost production and get ahead in the chip industry. We've done this. And yet, as we had in a really great piece by T.J. Rogers last year, who was the founding CEO of Cypress Semiconductor Corporation, by the time this outfit or consortium actually got a chip plant up and going in Texas, it was obsolescent. It couldn't keep up with the global competition that was going on in the world. He noted that layoffs started in 2002. So we know exactly how this rolls and how it's going to end up. It's not good. And again, the bigger point is that we could be doing so much more and better with that money if we were directing it more widely at tax credits broadly to any takers.
I agree about that TJ Rogers op-ed. Some op-eds come and go, and this is one that I keep coming back to. And the headline, I would commend it to people, is "Government Won't Fix the Semiconductor Shortage." And I'll just read a few lines from it. He says, "The semiconductor industry is well off and has a high market valuation, giving it access to cheap capital. More important, free government money induces horribly inefficient spending and undeserved payouts to executives and shareholders. I've seen it." He adds that semiconductor industry advocates argue that other countries will take market share if the U.S. government doesn't help. But the governments of Europe and mainland China have been throwing money at chip companies for decades, and neither has a highly competitive chip industry. I think that's a great point. And then one final one, and this gets to the argument I was making about AI, is he says the industry has moved into the software age in which the code that drives the chip is usually more important than the chip itself. The U.S. dominates in software, as Google well knows. Unquote. And I would suggest people go read that if they want to learn more about this from a guy who knows a thing or two about semiconductors. But Alicia, I mean, what do you make of this argument that a lot of these chips now, especially the lower level ones, are basically commodities, and the U.S. is very successful in designing them and is very successful in building the equipment that eventually makes them, but it can be okay to outsource some of this lower level stuff to places like Samsung and TSMC.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, that's what we've been doing really for the last couple of decades. That's been how the industry has evolved. It's much more efficient for the chip making or the chip designers. We call them chip makers, the NVIDIA, Advanced Micro Devices, Micron Technologies. A lot of these companies that we call chip makers, they actually don't make chips. They really design chips, and then they outsource the production to these really three big companies, Intel, TSMC, and Samsung, because given the economies of scale, it's just much more efficient to do so. Intel had actually kind of gotten out of the fabrication and was really doing a lot of more of its design work. But it's now seeking to become more of an integrated company and go back into fabricating and be a fabricator for other chip designers. Most of the value added comes from the chip design, in the design of chip making equipment. So it's actually one of the reasons, ironically, that we had a shortage of chips was because there's a shortage of chip making equipment. And so this bill won't necessarily solve that. Some of these, supply chain issues actually just need to be kind of worked out. There are different levels of advanced. There are advanced chips, which TSMC does actually, in terms of manufacturing those, it does actually have a, comparative advantage over Intel. But again, it's kind of shifting some of that production to the U.S. and other countries as it tries to diversify its supply chains. I don't think the U.S. should be seeking to get in to become dominant in chip making. I think that ship has sailed, even though we only have comprised 12% of chip making manufacturing. I don't think that that's a horrible defeat for the U.S. We don't even have workers to produce the chips that we supposedly want to subsidize. Actually, in the bill, there's $200 million just for worker training because there's expected to be a shortage of 25,000 workers in another few years. So we actually don't even have workers to make these chips that we want to subsidize, which is the grand irony of it. I think we would actually become much more competitive if we, one, reformed our immigration system to permit more immigration H-1Bs actually for designing these chips. I think the biggest threat to our dominance is actually the talent and either the high-skilled engineers staying in Taiwan or Canada or another country attracting them because they have a much more flexible immigration system. So I think that's where the focus really should be, is on improving our competitive dynamics, either through the immigration system or, I brought it up earlier, energy. And Texas is having issues right now with its power grid, and Samsung actually had to shut down a plant last week. And I don't think it was actually specified whether it's one of its chip making plants, but it does have them in Texas. But the potential threats to the grid and grid reliability could make the U.S. a lot less attractive to manufacture. So I think those are the things Congress should be focusing on, is how to shore up our own problems, some of which are government created.
But Kim, where is the Republican opposition to this industrial policy? I mean, this is the kind of thing that would have set people's hair on fire back in the Tea Party days, a $75 billion subsidy for a single industry. And especially given the fact that there's a pretty good chance that come November, Republicans will at least control the House, possibly the House and the Senate, and they can write their own kind of competition R&D bill however they want to write it. I mean, the only thing I can think of is that Republican leader Mitch McConnell at some point said that if there was a Democratic reconciliation bill with Joe Manchin's approval, that would probably dry up Republican support for this CHIPS bill. And so maybe now that Manchin has said there will be no climate spending bill, maybe now there's an effort to give him something in exchange for that. I mean, what's going on here, Kim?
Well, here's the first problem. The first problem is we're all big spenders now. Republicans and Democrats, if you look at the Congress in recent years, it's very demoralizing. About the only thing they can ever agree to do is spend some money. Now, I do think that there's going to be some growing pushback from Republicans to this, for the simple reason that this was in conference between the House and the Senate, and there was something like 900 issues outstanding. Republicans and Democrats were working through. Alicia alluded to this, that there were a lot of other provisions in here. Given the speed of that wasn't going at the pace that Chuck Schumer wanted and Nancy Pelosi wanted, they decided to now stop that entire process and strip out just the spending part and also a tax credit part for semiconductor fabrication and put that out there. That's going to annoy a lot of Republicans who wanted to see this process play out in conference. So you'll probably see some peel away from that. The bigger problem I see here, just because I think it needs to be put in context, is that you still have some Republicans, a significant number of Republicans in Congress that understand the folly of industrial policy and are speaking out against this bill and the spending and the misguided ideas behind it. But you have another faction of Republicans who, either for parochial reasons, because they'd like to see some of this money come to their state where they're going to see a semiconductor factory, they hope, or because they have a big presence of that industry in their state, they're for this. But also these Republicans who, I think in their rush to now cast themselves as the party that is behind the blue collar worker, the manufacturer worker, etc., that they feel as though they need to be backing these kind of schemes in which government does pick these winners and losers. I think that's a very unhealthy direction for the Republican Party. It's not necessarily new. I think it's important to put it in context. We have always had this struggle with corporate welfare. But you're right, Kyle. It was one of the things that really caused a reaction among rank and file voters out there, conservative voters, and helped lead to the end of the former Republican majority and the rise of the Tea Party. And my warning to Republicans is if they keep going down this road, they could see, more and more voters begin to really question what they're doing.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. And we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.